Have you ever noticed that history doesn't always move forward? Sometimes it moves backward. Right now, there's a sword sitting behind museum glass that modern engineers, armed with supercomputers, electron microscopes, and some of the most advanced materials labs on Earth, still can't perfectly reproduce. It isn't because we don't understand steel, and it isn't because we lack the technology. We have both. So why can't we just make another one? The answer isn't hidden inside the blade. It's hidden inside the process that created it. For centuries, this weapon became known as Damascus steel. Stories claimed it could cut through armor, stay razor-sharp after countless battles, and display flowing patterns unlike anything else in the medieval world. Many of those stories were exaggerated, but the engineering behind them wasn't. Damascus steel was never magic, never a single secret ingredient, and never the work of one extraordinary blacksmith. It was the product of an engineering system, so sophisticated that, once it vanished, the world spent centuries trying to figure out what had actually been lost. But here's the part almost nobody talks about. The real mystery isn't how Damascus steel was made. It's how an entire civilization let that knowledge slip away. To answer that, we have to travel nearly 4,000 kilometers from Damascus itself, because the story you've probably heard isn't where this one actually begins. Almost everyone gets one thing wrong about Damascus steel, and the mistake is baked right into the name. Most people assume these legendary blades were forged in the Syrian city of Damascus. It's an understandable guess, but it's the wrong one. For centuries, Damascus sat at the crossroads of some of the busiest trade routes on the planet. Merchants arrived from India, Persia, Central Asia, and North Africa carrying silk, spices, precious stones, and something far more valuable to a skilled swordsmith: small, unremarkable steel ingots. To an ordinary traveler, they looked like nothing. To the craftsmen of Damascus, they represented extraordinary potential. When forged with care, those ingots became blades famous for their flowing surface patterns, impressive edge retention, and reliability in combat. As the swords spread across the medieval world, so did their reputation. Travelers carried the stories from kingdom to kingdom. Merchants embellished them along the way, and soldiers came home convinced they'd witnessed something otherworldly. Over time, history and legend blurred together. Some claimed the blades could slice through armor with ease. Others swore they could cut a silk scarf floating in midair. Modern evidence doesn't back up most of those legends, but stripping away the myths doesn't make Damascus steel any less impressive. The real achievement was never supernatural. It was engineering. Damascus became famous not because it discovered this remarkable steel, but because its craftsmen knew exactly how to turn it into some of the finest blades the medieval world had ever seen. Which raises the obvious question: if Damascus wasn't where the steel was born, where did it come from? The answer starts in southern India, with something that looked almost embarrassingly ordinary: a small, dark lump of metal. No decoration, no inscription, nothing to suggest it would become one of history's most famous materials. And yet everything that made Damascus steel extraordinary was already sitting inside it. More than 2,000 years before Damascus became known for its blades, metal workers in southern India had already mastered a material we now call wood steel. Long before blast furnaces or industrial mills existed, these craftsmen built a remarkably sophisticated process out of little more than clay, charcoal, iron, and hard-won experience. Instead of heating iron in an open forge, they sealed carefully chosen pieces of it inside small clay crucibles, along with carbon-rich organic material, then placed the crucibles into furnaces hot enough to run for hours. Inside those sealed containers, something remarkable happened. As the iron melted, it absorbed carbon from the material around it. The result wasn't just stronger iron. It was a remarkably pure, high-carbon steel with an unusually consistent internal structure. Today's materials scientists can explain exactly why that mattered. The craftsmen who created it couldn't. They had no chemistry, no microscopes, no way to measure carbon content. What they had was generations of observation and refinement, which let them repeat the process with startling consistency. That might be the first forgotten engineering lesson buried inside this story. You don't always need to understand the science to master the process. Once the crucibles cooled, the steel solidified into small, rounded ingots that looked completely unremarkable to almost anyone who saw them. But each one carried generations of accumulated knowledge, and its journey was only beginning. Merchants loaded the ingots onto ships crossing the Indian Ocean, or carried them along Persian trade routes, across deserts and mountain passes, and the borders of empires, before they finally reached the workshops of Damascus. Those trade routes moved more than goods. They carried engineering knowledge from one civilization to another. But here's what set Damascus apart. Receiving extraordinary steel was one thing. Preserving it was the real challenge. Every heating cycle, every hammer strike, every moment inside the forge risked destroying the very properties that made the steel exceptional. By the time a Damascus blacksmith raised his hammer for the first strike, most of the engineering had already happened. The hardest part was only just beginning. So what was actually going on? A rare metal, a lost ingredient, a formula that vanished with history. Surprisingly, none of that. The greatest secret of Damascus steel wasn't what it was made from. It was how it was made, and everything depended on control. Not the computerized kind. Human control. The craftsmen of Damascus had no thermometers, no way to measure carbon percentages, and had never seen a microscope, yet they learned to manipulate steel with astonishing precision. It started with the wood's ingot itself, which typically arrived carrying a relatively high carbon concentration, somewhere between 1 and 2%. That carbon was both the steel's greatest strength and its greatest liability. Too little, and the blade couldn't hold an edge. Too much, and it turned dangerously brittle. Finding that balance was only the beginning. Temperature was the real test. Every heating cycle had to stay within a surprisingly narrow window. Push the steel too hot, and the carbide structures behind many of its best properties could dissolve back into the surrounding metal. Work it too cold, and airline cracks would form long before the sword ever saw a battlefield. Neither mistake gave any warning. No gauges, no instruments, no second chances. Every decision permanently changed the material, which meant a Damascus blacksmith wasn't just shaping a blade. He was protecting a structure he couldn't even see. So how did they know what to do? They learned to read the metal directly, the color of the glowing blade, the sound of each hammer strike, the resistance pushing back through the handle. It became a language that existed long before metallurgy was ever treated as a science. Over dozens of careful heating and forging cycles, carbon-rich carbide particles slowly arranged themselves into fine microscopic networks running through the blade. Those networks did two jobs at once. They helped the cutting edge resist wear, and they produced the flowing patterns that made Damascus steel instantly recognizable. Those waves weren't carved or engraved. They were fingerprints left behind by the process itself. Materials engineers today call this microstructure control, and modern factories achieve it with computerized furnaces, precision sensors, and lab analysis. The craftsmen of Damascus got remarkably close to the same result using nothing but experience, observation, and patience, which might be the most impressive part of the whole story. They couldn't explain the science, but they understood the material well enough to make it work. Which brings up another question. Were these blades really as good as their reputation, or did people simply want to believe the legends? The honest answer is both simpler and more impressive than the myths. Damascus steel couldn't slice through solid stone, couldn't cleave another sword in half without damaging itself, and was never some indestructible superweapon. Those stories grew over centuries as merchants, travelers, and soldiers retold them, each version a little more extraordinary than the last. But strip the myths away, and the real engineering achievement comes into focus. Damascus steel solved one of metallurgy's oldest problems, the trade-off between hardness and toughness. Those two properties rarely cooperate. Push hardness too far and steel turns brittle. Push toughness too far and the edge dulls quickly. materials engineers are still chasing that balance for knives, tools, aircraft parts, and industrial machinery today. Nearly 1,000 years ago, Damascus craftsmen were solving the same problem with experience instead of equations. The hard, carbide-rich regions helped the blade resist wear and hold an edge, while the surrounding steel stayed flexible enough to absorb impact without cracking as easily as many comparable high-carbon blades of the period. That combination didn't make the sword magical. It made it dependable, and on a medieval battlefield, dependability could mean survival. A blade that stayed sharp needed less sharpening. A blade less likely to crack gave its owner more confidence than any legend could. There's another detail worth noting. No two Damascus blades were ever identical. Each one carried its own flowing pattern, shaped by countless small decisions made during forging, in a sense, a signature written in steel rather than ink. Modern testing confirms Damascus steel really was exceptional for its era, though never perfect. Like any weapon, it could chip or break, and its performance always depended on the skill of the smith who made it and the person who carried it into battle. Maybe that's what makes it remarkable, not that it broke the laws of physics, but that it came remarkably close to solving an engineering challenge we're still working on, which leaves one last mystery. If these blades were this valuable, why didn't the knowledge survive? Here's something that seems almost impossible. How does a technology admired for centuries, used by kings, carried into battle by elite warriors, and traded across continents, simply vanish? Not through some sudden catastrophe, but slowly, almost unnoticed. Damascus steel didn't disappear because someone forgot a recipe. It disappeared because an entire engineering ecosystem fell apart, piece by piece, with every stage dependent on the one before it. It started with specific iron ores, drawn from a handful of regions that had supplied steelmakers for generations and containing trace elements that likely shaped how the steel behaved. Next came the wood's production itself, carefully prepared crucibles, the right balance of iron and carbon, long heating cycles, and craftsmen who'd spent years learning by doing. Even a small mistake could produce a completely different material. And making the ingots was only the start. They still had to travel thousands of kilometers across the Indian Ocean and along Persian trade routes, through deserts, mountain passes, and shifting political borders before ever reaching Damascus. That wasn't simple trade. It was an international engineering network, and like any network, it was only as strong as its weakest link. As the centuries passed, that network began to fray. Trade routes shifted, empires collapsed, wars disrupted commerce, and mining regions declined. The steady supply of high-quality wood steel grew increasingly unreliable. But the greater loss probably wasn't the material, it was the people. Master craftsmen rarely wrote down detailed instructions. Their workshops were their textbooks, and their apprenticeships were their universities. Knowledge lived in memory, in routine, in habit, not on paper. A master didn't just teach someone how to forge a blade. He taught them how to judge temperature by color, how to hear the difference between healthy steel and damaged steel, how to catch a mistake before it became visible. None of that reduced to a simple recipe. It only existed through years of practice, which is exactly what made it so fragile. When a workshop closed, its knowledge often closed with it. When a master died without passing everything on, centuries of experience could vanish in a single generation. There was never one final sword, one final blacksmith, one final workshop. The knowledge just faded, one apprentice, one generation at a time. Today, researchers can study surviving Damascus blades with incredible precision. They can map carbide structures, measure carbon content, examine features invisible to the naked eye. What they can't observe is something far more important. The thousands of small decisions made by a craftsman standing beside the forge. Some engineering knowledge lives inside the material. Some lives only inside the people who made it, and once those people are gone, recovering it becomes one of the hardest problems in the history of engineering. Which leads to one final question. If modern science understands so much about Damascus steel, Why can't we just rebuild the process from scratch? After a century of research, millions of dollars in metallurgical study, and some of the most advanced instruments ever built, the honest answer is both yes and no. Over the past 100 years, materials science has transformed our understanding of ancient steel. Researchers can now examine surviving blades with scanning electron microscopes capable of revealing structures thousands of times smaller than a human hair. They can precisely measure carbon content, map carbide networks, analyze heat treatment effects, and compare every detail against modern experimental steels. In many ways, we understand Damascus steel better today than at any point in its history. That research has settled several long-standing questions. We know now that Damascus steel wasn't magic, wasn't forged from some mysterious lost element, and wasn't beyond the technical understanding of medieval craftsmen. It was the product of sophisticated metallurgy, careful manufacturing, and generations of hands-on experience. Modern researchers have even produced steels that share real characteristics with the historical blades, some matching their hardness, others reproducing similar surface patterns, and a few labs coming remarkably close to recreating the original microscopic carbide structures. Those are genuine achievements in modern materials science. But here's where the story gets more interesting. Understanding a finished material isn't the same as understanding the process that made it. A microscope can tell us what the steel looks like today. It can't tell us how a blacksmith judged the perfect forging temperature just by watching the glow of the metal, how long an ingot rested between heating cycles, or the countless instincts built up over decades of practice. None of that was ever written down, because the craftsmen who developed it never imagined anyone would need to reconstruct their work centuries later. That's the real difference between analyzing engineering and inheriting it. Modern science can often reproduce the result. Reproducing the knowledge that created it is a different problem entirely, which is probably why researchers keep studying Damascus steel. Not because they're chasing a mythical sword, but because they're trying to understand how knowledge itself gets created, shared, and eventually lost. Maybe Damascus steel was never really a story about a sword. Maybe it's always been a story about knowledge. So after all of this, maybe we've been asking the wrong question from the start. For centuries, people have asked what made Damascus steel so extraordinary, but that was probably never the real mystery. The better question is this: how did an entire engineering tradition become so advanced and then quietly disappear? If there's one lesson worth taking from this story, it's that great engineering is almost never the work of a single genius. No individual invented Damascus steel. No single blacksmith figured out every technique. No lone craftsman created the blades history remembers. It was the result of an entire ecosystem working together. Miners extracting the right ores, steelmakers turning them into high-quality wood ingots, merchants hauling them across continents, blacksmiths refining them into finished blades, and masters training the next generation of apprentices, who eventually became masters themselves. Each person held onto a small piece of knowledge that seemed unremarkable on its own. Together, those pieces became something extraordinary. That's how most great engineering actually works, not through sudden breakthroughs, but through thousands of small improvements accumulated over decades, sometimes centuries. Every generation inherits knowledge, refines it, and passes it forward until eventually someone breaks the chain. A workshop closes. An apprentice never finishes learning. A trade route disappears. A craft stops being practiced. None of those events look important on their own, but together they can erase a technology that once seemed impossible to lose. Maybe that's why Damascus steel still fascinates engineers today. Not because it's hard to understand, but because it's a reminder of how fragile engineering knowledge can be. We tend to measure progress by what we invent next. Damascus steel asks a different question. What are we failing to preserve? Invention creates the future, but preservation is what allows that future to actually exist. That might be the greatest engineering lesson this sword has left behind. Damascus steel isn't only a story about medieval blacksmiths. It's a reminder that every generation is responsible for protecting the knowledge it inherits. Maybe that's the real legacy here. Not that medieval craftsmen had mysterious powers, and not that they stumbled onto some magical metal lost to history, but that they achieved extraordinary engineering through patience, observation, and generations of accumulated experience. History tends to celebrate great inventions. It rarely celebrates the systems that let those inventions survive. Damascus steel wasn't protected by patents. It wasn't stored in libraries or preserved in digital archives. It survived because people taught other people, master to apprentice, generation to generation, until one day that chain quietly broke, and centuries of engineering knowledge went with it. We like to assume technology only moves forward, that each generation automatically knows more than the last. History says otherwise. Knowledge doesn't only disappear when civilizations collapse. Sometimes it disappears simply because no one realized it was worth preserving. That's why this story still matters. Not because we need medieval swords, but because every modern engineer, scientist, and craftsman inherits knowledge someone else created. The greatest technologies humanity has ever built aren't just inventions. They're conversations spanning centuries, and those conversations only continue if someone chooses to keep them alive. Maybe that's the real lesson Damascus steel leaves behind. Not a blade, not a legend. A reminder that engineering isn't only about creating knowledge, it's about making sure it isn't forgotten. I'm Scout, and this is Forgotten Engineering. Every lost technology still has something to teach us. Subscribe, and let's uncover the next forgotten masterpiece together. I'll see you in the next video.